Hello, and welcome back to the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Arthur, PMW's multimedia editor, and I've returned from my overseas escapade with editor Robin Langford to Cannes Lion Festival of Creativity 2024. A big thank you to all of you who listened to the Cannes Lion mini-series of the podcast. The feedback's been so positive, and a big thank you to those of you who contributed to the show on the ground at Cannes Lion as well. I must say, however, I am relieved to be back in the safety and sanctity of the show's London studio. The audio sounds a lot better. The environment's far more quiet, albeit not quite as picturesque. On an editing front, it's certainly a lot easier for me. So it's a big relief to be back in one piece and recording the show from our lovely, lovely studio here in Twickenham. Moving on to this episode of the show, we've got a return to the classic Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast, if you will. Up the top, we've got my editorial colleague, PMW's premium content editor, Jyoti Rambhai, joining me to discuss the latest IPA Bellwether report, which broke at the end of last week. We discussed the top-line results from the report, as well as highlighting some of the industry's reaction. And we look ahead to the future and what's honestly a bit more of a buoyant outlook and an optimistic outlook for the broader UK economy, which is super exciting. Following on from that conversation, not only did Q2 just draw to a close, but 30th of June marked the end of the previous financial year, and the start of July marked the beginning of a new one. And with a new financial year ahead of us, we thought it was appropriate to bring on Jodie Clayton, the Associate Director of Marketing, Digital and E-commerce at Major Players, to chat all things the marketing job market. PMW recently released its Workforce Report on the website for our subscribers, and Major Players and Jodie contributed with some of their data to that report, and that's the crux of the conversation we have at the back end of this episode. Jodie tells all when it comes to what kind of roles are people being hired to do in the industry at the moment. What kind of roles are we seeing less opportunities for? What are the skills that are becoming really, really critical to getting hired in the market? We compare junior roles versus more senior roles and the opportunities across both. We also discuss salaries and what's happening on that front. Are they getting bigger? Are they getting smaller? How are they responding to the economic uplift? Just a real dissection of the state of play for all things marketing jobs. I'm sure you're all anxious to hear that. So as always, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. Jyoti Rambhai, welcome back to the Performance Marketing Unlocked studio. It's
Hi,
so
Joe.
good to have you here.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, it's good to be back. It's been a while.
Yeah, we were saying off air, not since Unlocked.
Yeah, I know. I can't believe it's been that long. It wasn't intentional, by the way. It's just happened that way.
No, you haven't been avoiding us, but
Yeah.
it certainly has flown by the week. So much has happened.
I know. Just in industry and just in life as well.
Yeah, it's been awfully busy. A good opportunity now to shake off any rust, though. It's just you and I opening up this episode of the show. What are we here to talk about, Jyoti?
I believe it's the IPA Bellwether report, yeah.
And you are correct. It is the latest results from the 2024 Q2 IPA Bellwether report, which was published on Thursday of last week. Just to give the listeners the top line, the UK marketing ad spend recorded growth for a 13th consecutive quarter, which is over 3 years now. And I think set against the backdrop of a pretty turbulent economy shows how post-pandemic the UK advertising industry has really been sort of able to remain relatively stable and serve as a bit of a bedrock for the broader economy that's experienced a lot of turbulence. And something that's particularly buoyant about this report, which is largely positive more than anything else, is we actually had the highest levels of growth in a decade. And that's at 15.9% in terms of growth, and that's compared to 9.4% in Q1. So pretty positive, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's also pretty high as well. Like, if you think about what was happening last year, you know, high inflation, cost of living crisis, yeah, you think people would be like a bit cautious. But then I think marketing has been a bit cautious as well.
No, and I think the quarter over quarter, you could see, you know, people were panicking at points in Q1 when they're looking at the main media dip and saying that we're a little too short-term focused. And this quarter, that sort of corrected itself. But yeah, the top line takeaway is it's 13 consecutive quarters of marketing spend growth, which shows that we've had a real sort of longevity. And I think this is probably the most optimistic report post-pandemic, but the fact that we're hitting a decade-long high of growth this quarter, it's actually the second highest level in almost a quarter of a century, this quarter's growth. So it's pretty significant.
I think as well, like, that's largely down to the way the industry is evolving and where spend is going. So if you look at ad spend, the Bellwether report has revised its forecast for a higher spend for 2024 and into 2025. And I think a lot of that is driven by money going into performance channels. And even post-pandemic, consumer habits changed. People were forced to buy online, which then resulted in marketers investing in their performance channels, investing in people working in those performance channels. And that's sort of continued, you know, when we hit turbulent times like we did last year, but budgets are squeezed. Yes, you know, businesses are looking to cut expenses. But the thing with performance marketing channels is there's a direct return on investment. So people can see the real term impact it has their spend has.
When done well, there's a direct return. I suppose it's a good it's a short-term strategy to sort of maintain. And we mentioned last year that a lot of experts sort of said you've got to, and we do know that you can't be all lower funnel. You've got to move up the funnel as well and try and find that brand performance and a balance between long-term and short-term. And we'll jump into that when we touch on the categories. But I think before we do that, it's also important to highlight that real-term ad spend is not only predicted to grow in 2025 and beyond, but consistently, since I've been covering the Bellwether for over a year now, these quarterly reports, for the first time, 2024 real-term ad spend is predicted to not contract. Now, it's not predicted to grow. It's going to be a total flatline, according to S&P Global Market Intelligence's latest revision of its GDP forecast in terms of real-term ad spend. But that's no contraction is better than any contraction. And you know, we're sort of definitely heading towards growth, which is positive.
Yeah, and I think that's a reflection of the broader economy as, like, inflation's come down, interest rates are sort of
rumoured to be getting a cut if the Bank of England holds true to their promise. We'll see.
Hopefully, but they have been pretty stable for the last few quarters. So yeah, I think generally it's 2024 looks to be very positive.
Yeah, certainly from what we've had, pandemic to cost of living crisis, and a very turbulent political and geopolitical climate as well. And I think with a new government, we might just see certainly optimism further on as well.
And I think there was an element of maybe some brands and agencies holding back or just waiting to see what happened in the run-up to the elections. But it's, as we expected, it's a change of government. So I think a lot of businesses are probably looking to spend maybe in Q3 and definitely in Q4 this year. Yeah,
absolutely. And if we move on to the categories now, because we should say that events grew the most this quarter, expanding 17.2%. which is a slight slowdown compared to last quarter's 23.1%, but it's still the largest growth across any of the categories, and that's more of a continued, people like getting back face to face and having conversations. And, you know, just the events we've had in June alone, from Cannes, Adweek Europe, MadFest, Shop Talk. So there's been a litany of event investment, and it's no surprise that that's going to continue.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not a surprise. And this is quite a social industry, so people do like getting together. They do like speaking about some of the things, the trends that we're seeing. So, yeah, I'm not surprised by events being one of the biggest.
No, but I think the biggest change from quarter to quarter in terms of the categories is in May media spend. Now, that's had a slight contraction in Q1 of 0.7%, which sort of set off some alarm bells in Q1 from our experts, but it's now returned to growth, a modest 3.5%, which indicates increased business confidence in investing in the long term and those more sort of big ticket advertising campaigns.
So what I found interesting about that actually, so a lot of that spend is actually online. According to the report, it's up 15.3% from 7.1%. And then there's also video, which has the Bellwether report said a net balance of 7.8%, up from 0.8%.
Which is a big increase.
So that's a huge increase. So both of those, I think there's definitely been a growth in brands investing in CTV, so advertising platforms like Netflix, Disney Plus, Paramount, Amazon Ads, and then you can't also forget like ITVX. And I think a lot of brands are seeing the benefits of advertising through this. I mean, everyone's watching TV through these platforms more than your traditional linear TV. So yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of investment in through these mediums, should I say.
And everything else that makes up main media, when you look aside from online and video, which are really, really driving the main media bounce back, the remaining monitored categories were either stagnant with little to no growth or contractions. So we had out of home 0.0% net balance, and then contractions in audio and published brands as well.
So the audio one did surprise me because it said a net balance of minus 5.5% from minus 4.5%. But I was thinking that this is an area that we might see some growth, especially with podcasts and advertising channels becoming a bit more popular, I would say.
A lot of the rhetoric I'm hearing is that, we're a bit behind the US in this when it comes to the UK, and perhaps the industry is missing a trick when it comes to audio advertising.
Yeah, and maybe we are a bit behind, but yeah, it did surprise me that the Bellwether report suggested there would be a contraction rather than a growth. In my head, I would have expected maybe it be stagnated or plateau. But yeah, I guess we'll see.
It's definitely a trend to watch. It's a really interesting one. And another point on the categories to round out is when we look down at the lower funnel perspective, sales promotions, they actually saw the third strongest expansion in budgets among the categories this quarter, with the net balance of firms posting growth up to 4.9% in Q1. Q2, this rose to 6.9%, which is actually high across the last 12 months. So it shows that these short-term strategies of sales promotions haven't been thrown to the wayside with the sort of return to investment in main media. And it comes to that idea of brand performance when both lower funnel and upper funnel strategies are being emphasized, which is really good to see, really, from an industry health perspective.
Yeah, and I think especially towards the end of last year, I think there was a lot of emphasis on the sales and bringing business in, or in some cases selling their products and services. So I guess I'm not surprised either with that one.
Yeah, summed up reasonably well by Paul Bainsfair, the IPA Director General. He said, in line with the brightening economy, decreasing levels of inflation and a new government, this quarter's Bellwether report reveals real vim and vigour regarding UK companies' marketing spend intentions. An interesting point that Paul raised, however, which I think is important for marketers to be aware of, is that while this is broadly positive, we do need to note that inflation levels have come down, but this hasn't yet translated into prices. So strains on household finances are still very much there. We forget we did have a recession, and some of the flow-on effect certainly hasn't gone away. So consumers' pockets are still, especially while we're awaiting interest rate cuts and inflation to sort of translate into lower prices, they're still a little bit hamstrung in terms of their pockets and their spending. So it's good to see business confidence prevailing, and this should improve into the back half of the year. And into 2025. But for now, consumers' confidence still isn't quite in line with the rest of the economy.
Yeah, but I think that will come, especially as we head into Q4, the golden quarter, and with Christmas. I think
It'll be a really interesting golden quarter.
Yeah, I think that will come. And just speaking of that, something Joe Hayes said, so he's the principal economist at S&P Global Market Intelligence and also the author of the Bellwether Report. He said that a lot of businesses shrugged off the general elections and sort of put it as a factor to consider when assessing the marketing budgets in the second quarter. And that's partly because growth jumped to a 10-year high. I think that's true to a certain extent, but I would say that some businesses, while they considered it, I wouldn't say they shrugged it off completely. I think it was in the back of their minds, they knew it was coming, and maybe were a bit cautious of where their money was going, but that didn't sort of impact their budget. So I think they were probably cautious in the lead up to the general elections, and I think now we'll maybe see them spending a little bit more, but that doesn't mean to say they shrugged it off.
I agree. I think postulating on what comes next from this report, you'd like to think basically it's there for marketers to win over consumers and encourage spend.
Yeah.
And, finally that might be reflected in lower prices and easing of, on sort of pressures on household income. But the golden quarter, you'd like to think that consumers are going to be spending and marketers are going to get them going. And likewise, as the year progresses, now that there is a new government in power and the bulk of this data was collected prior to the election, it's Q2, then Q3 and 4, maybe businesses will start to act on it now that it is very much assured and affirmed it's a new government and they will behave as they will, and
do you know what? It'll be interesting to see what the next weather report forecasts, because we're in a period of things now settling down, especially with the new government now in place. The next quarter, the next few months, we'll see maybe the new government start to take a few actions. So it'll be good to see what impact that has. And then what happens with interest rates. Does the Bank of England hold out on its promise and lower it?
Let's hope so.
Yeah, let's see what happens.
No, certainly. I think those are the takeaways. It's a very buoyant and optimistic report. It's largely positive, and I think there's certainly cause for marketers to feel good heading into the back end of the year, but really the opportunity's there, and it'll be really, really interesting to see how the market responds to these changing economic conditions as things finally appear to be on the up and up. So Q3, Q4 and into 2025, we'll have to see what the IPA Bellwether says. But we'll wrap up the Bellwether report there. If you do want any more of our coverage on that, you can refer to the website because we've got a litany of reaction pieces from industry experts as well as our news coverage of the report itself. So we'll direct you to the website for that. In the meantime, we're now going to welcome Jodie Clayton.Associate Director, Marketing, Digital and E-commerce at Major Players to the studio to talk about PMW's Workforce Report, a little more loosely, and then focus on some really interesting Major Players data to do with the state of pay, as we've dubbed it, in the marketing industry when it comes to jobs and salaries. So we'll jump to that conversation now. But Jyoti, thanks very much for joining us. And you're going to stick around for that chat with Jodie too.
Yes, I am. So thanks, Joe.
Jodie, thank you very much for joining us in the Performance Marketing Unlocked studio today.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, really well. Thank you. Excited to be here.
We were saying off air, it's your first ever podcast. So we're excited and honoured that you joined us.
I was hoping you weren't going to tell everybody.
The one thing I'm nervous about for this episode is we've got myself, Joe, you, Jodie, and we're joined again by our premium content editor at PMW, Jyoti Rambhai. It's really testing out my enunciation skills with my sort of Australian drawl between Joe, Jodie and Jyoti. I imagine you're both as confused as I am.
It's going to be an interesting session for sure.
It is,
Yeah, but it's exciting. And we should say, Jodie, you're in studio, as are you, Jyoti, to talk a little bit today about the state of the marketing workforce. We're going to sort of recap 2023 and then look at what the data and the trends are telling us in terms of the workforce for 2024. So, Jyoti, why don't you give our listeners a brief introduction to the state of play?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Joe. So PMW launched its big performance marketing salary survey last week. It's a series of reports published weekly throughout July, which analyses trends within the industry's workforce over the last year. So the report uses PMW's own data from our jobs board, and some of our key findings include how salaries on certain job roles have seen a significant decrease. So this is both in terms of literally, so the jobs being advertised are at a lower salary range in 2023 compared to the previous year, as well as in real terms. So I'm not going to reveal the figures on here, but if you are interested, please do check out our report, which you'll find on our website. But to add context to what I'm saying, so 2023 was a challenging year for many agencies and brands. And with inflation reaching record levels and a cost of living crisis, many marketers found their budgets being squeezed. So add a lower salary into that. Let's just say the state of pay appeared bleak for some marketers.
A lot of unhappy marketers.
No. And this is sort of also reflected in the number of jobs that were advertised last year. We saw a real slump, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail in our next report, which comes out later this week. But when business start to cut their expenses, marketing is often one of the first
to go.
Feel that pinch and that squeeze. And we did see redundancies as well last year. But I want to say it's not all doom and gloom. Surely 2024 is looking a bit optimistic, right, Jodie?
It's slowly moving in the right direction.
So what are you seeing? What trends are you seeing in 2024 off the back of that sort of turbulent year?
Yeah, I think, and thanks for that, because last year I think was really tough because we'd seen the market shift quite considerably from what it had been during and post-pandemic, where there was quite a large boom. This year we have seen growth quarter on quarter, and I think we've seen more roles become available. Last year it seemed businesses, agencies and brands were both just sitting tight. This year they can't spend another 12 months of sitting tight. So we're starting to see more investment where it's needed. We're starting to see maybe reinvestment in certain channels, which we can talk about. But ultimately, although the market's quite sporadic, it's not a consistent incline. We are seeing quarter on quarter growth, more roles coming up, and that attrition rate slowly starting to improve as well. So
okay.
As sort of the outsider here coming at this, where I'm certainly not the expert, I find that marketing as an industry, as you mentioned there, Jyoti, when things get a little bit more turbulent economically, marketing feels the strain the most, perhaps, or at least sort of it's the first to go when you look at the budgets become tighter. Marketers have to do more with lesser budget, then they're getting paid less money themselves. Jyoti, up top of this episode, we spoke about the latest IPA Bellwether results, which were, broadly speaking, resoundingly positive. And it appears that the sentiment under the new UK government, inflation's finally starting to ease. We're heading into the remainder of 2024 and beyond with, I guess, post-pandemic, perhaps the most optimistic anyone's been about the economy. So does that then in turn flow on to marketers where they will start getting some of that budget back and that will be reflected in the salaries? Or am I wrong to assume that?
I'll let Jodie answer the bit about salaries.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it's definitely optimistic. And before we began, I just looked up the inflation rate for the UK. And we're sitting at 2% right now, which is the last reported by the Bank of England in June. And if you compare that to what we were seeing last year, we were reaching like 8% at one point. So that's quite a difference. Now, interest rates actually in the UK have sort of remained relatively stable at around about 5.25%, which is still a little bit high.
Well, the Bank of England continually promise interest rate cuts. We don't know if and when those will come, but they are saying it will happen.
But all of that, I think, leads to business confidence being up.
Yeah.
And if business confidence is up, they're more likely to spend. So with the IPA Bellwether, I think that's reflecting they're wanting to spend on ad spend, on marketing spend. And I would like to say that should then reflect upon salaries.
Yeah,
I don't
the
know,
burning questions, Jodie. Reflect on salaries.
And that's the thing. And I think what we've seen in the market is that budgets have been cut, but it's very much more about spending those budgets as wisely as possible as well. So there's been a real focus on things like return on ad spend and return on investment, CPAs, as well as like lifetime value. So the two key areas that we've seen particularly across performance are your paid channels, so your paid search, paid social, very much more measurable, as well as then obviously your retention, your acquisition, and then your retention in terms of your CRM and loyalty as well. So I think what we've seen is that the budgets are still being very much invested, but they're being invested in areas where they can see what return they're getting for that budget.
So how does that reflect on then
the salary?
Yeah.
So that's the other area, is I think if you look at the marketing landscape overall, there are certainly areas where salaries are maybe slightly lower than what they have been. But interestingly, in those certain performance channels, it's still quite a competitive market. So it's where we've seen most roles coming through. In terms of a candidate market, people are quite nervous to move. So therefore, the one thing that they're likely to move for is salary. So in those sorts of areas, we've seen maybe still a slight increase in salaries because businesses are having to offer candidates what they're looking for to move, and being competitive in that landscape, because good candidates, particularly in those channels, will have 2 or 3 opportunities going on at one time. So it really depends, I think, on the area of marketing that you're recruiting in as to what that salary looks like.
Okay. Just on that, so earlier I mentioned last year we saw quite a lot of redundancies.
Yeah.
And in terms of the number of jobs advertised, are we seeing the jobs being quite competitive? So there's more candidates going for roles, and is that affecting salaries, for example?
Yeah, for sure, because I think last year there just weren't the level of roles that we would expect, but equally not a lot of people were looking except for those that were active due to redundancies and restructures. We're talking now 18 months, nearly 2 years later, that the market's been quite tough. So what you're now seeing is a lot of people that have been in their roles also start looking as the economy's starting to move. So the increase in applications for some roles, if you're looking at more of your senior level roles or multi-channel roles, you're looking at anything between 300 and 600 applications per vacancy that's advertised. So the knock-on of that is businesses that are trying to hire directly themselves are having to deal with, I mean, even us as, agencies have to manage that application process, but how businesses are navigating that themselves with internal talent teams or hiring managers themselves is crazy.
Sorry, Jyoti. It's highly competitive when it comes to senior positions. What about the more junior roles? Because I know something that we've covered a lot at PMW is this idea of the talent pool, and maybe there being a bit of a talent gap when you're looking at people coming out of university, more junior marketers going into sort of first, second role. It's been a really big point of concern. So is it just as competitive in terms of people applying for these jobs? Is it trying to find diamonds in the rough? Can you speak to the talent pool at all on those junior positions?
Yeah, the junior market's always really challenging, because I think when you're coming out of education and university, it's unlikely you step straight into, let's say, a performance role or a CRM role or something quite channel specific.
That requires a bit more
You tend
experience.
to find that they're a marketing assistant or executive, or a digital marketing assistant or executive, and they're a support to somebody. And the challenge has been, particularly over the last couple of years, is that people don't have the cost really to hire for support. A lot of that responsibility has lent more so into a specialist or a manager. So a lot of the hiring that we've seen, I would say, has been between the sort of mid to senior, so that 40 to 80 salary banding. The junior roles we haven't seen a huge amount of. Equally, the senior roles, again, it's been really slow in that market, I think, because 18 months ago when redundancies started to be made, it's that senior market where it's cost save, restructure and things like that. So it's tough for anybody, I think, coming into that market, because finding that initial role to get into the industry is really quite challenging.
So I was going to ask more on in terms of the skill levels. Do you think the junior roles or the talent coming in have the relevant skills for the industry, especially at the rate it's evolving, and with AI now being put into or being integrated into businesses like BAU?
Yeah, and I think that's the other talking point on it, isn't it? And being honest, we don't, for major players where we are a specialist agency, we tend to work more of the mid to senior market anyway, because we place a lot of people that already have that channel or key experience. But there's a lot of talk around where AI is being integrated into people's roles to support them. And a lot of that we saw when publishing our census this year was using AI for content creation or for research or for creative design. And they're areas where you would usually see maybe an exec or somebody supporting with that. So there is that kind of concern as well as to whether managers or that mid-level market are starting to use AI as more of a support to their role instead of the more junior assistant or exec level roles.
So are we seeing new job roles or job descriptions evolve because of AI?
It's really interesting, and we had some stats on this because we didn't see, when we ran our report, we had just under 4,000 people complete our survey, and 47% of those people said they hardly use it in their current role, which was huge.
Wow.
When we think about how much it's being spoke about. So I think we're still in quite a, I suppose, knowledge learning phase of how can it really be used.
That's
to
fascinating. It's
enhance
it's inconsistent with the rhetoric, isn't it? And we were just out on the ground in Cannes Line, and one of the questions we were asking marketers, quite high level marketers, was, are you an AI optimist or pessimist? And it's all optimism, and all of the data is saying there's a lot of intent to use AI, but actual use cases.
And that's I think the thing, isn't it? As I think everyone's still in a real learning phase with it. 21% said they see it as a threat.
Wow.
Because I think that was the initial message when everyone started talking about it, wasn't it? It's going to take over our jobs because it's going to write content for us. And I think people didn't want to hear about whether people were using Chat GPT, for example. But I think we're in a stage now, we're really starting to see the benefit of using it. And we're seeing it more. I don't think we're seeing it in job specs or roles massively evolving right now, but I think we'll certainly see over the next 6 months it come into play a lot more.
With that, obviously you need a certain level of skills to operate these tools. So I know in your report you use the phrase reskilling revolution. Are we going to see that in 2024, come 2025?
I think we're going to have to. Yeah. It's just a case of how, and I think that's the thing, is that you'll have talent that are working in really forward-thinking businesses that will have the opportunity to get training and to learn this on the job. And it's going to be those that can learn that and integrate it as part of their role that are going to then really add value. So you're then going to have to see businesses doing a lot to retain people with that, because it's not going to be something that's going to be available for people to upskill and to start really developing themselves across the board imminently.
Going back to the fact that I guess the sort of middle management, when you move from junior to middle positions before those really high level exec roles, is the area where we're seeing the most opportunity perhaps. Is that then an even bigger issue for the talent pool in terms of retention? As you mentioned there, you finally might hire some good talent into a junior position, but they put a couple of years into that role and they start becoming eligible for these slightly bigger opportunities where there's a bit more agency for them to go out there and get in those roles. So where's the struggle there for businesses in terms of retention?
I think that's the thing, is I think there are still businesses that will hire at a junior level because they have things like their apprenticeship programs or grad schemes and things like that can offer people those opportunities. But unless you can offer that junior market constant learning and development and progression, you run the risk of losing them quite quickly. The mid-level, so at your manager levels, I think there's become a lot more accountability and expectation, particularly when you're a specialist in a channel, to start learning the full kind of funnel and skill sets required. So the data roles, for example, particularly in paid social, paid search, you're now expected to have experience in data and analysis, as well as the campaign management experience and hands-on expertise there. But you're also seeing the blend of the creative now come into the roles as well. So we've seen, particularly over the last 6 to 12 months, a huge increase, say in paid social specifically, where you're no longer just channel managing, you're looking at the creative and briefing content teams and responsible for what are we actually putting out through the channel, as well as the management, as well as the reporting side as well. So whereas previously you would have different teams or areas that would look after.
I think because of all of these different skills that come into it, roles are becoming a little bit more fluid and ill-defined. And you might even find that job expectations for the same role in two separate companies are quite different. And we talk about, I think that might be where, I think AI will only continue to blur that even more, because it really depends where an organization is in that sort of journey of integration. But data, and I know even outside of marketing, as journalists, there's now this expectation to be able to be a data journalist as well as everything else that comes along with it. And it's the same in marketing. You've got to have these data and analytic skills. So I think AI is just going to become another sort of piece of that puzzle. And everyone's going to need to have all these transferable skills just to fit under one single umbrella.
But this is the thing, right? Marketing's a trend, and it takes time to develop talent and people with those expertise in the market. And we saw this back when social media started to boom. Businesses started to want to invest into social media platforms, into their organic social, and they'd come to agencies and say, right, we need to hire a social media manager and we want them to have X amount of years of experience in social. And you're there saying, well, nobody has that expertise yet because this is new. And now we're at a point where you can go away and you can absolutely find a lot of people in social media. The challenge is finding people in specific paid channels, which people are now investing a lot more into as that social's evolved or as search has evolved. And again, we're going to have the same with AI. Everybody's going to start to look for, well, I need this experience, and it's not going to be in the market, and it's going to take time for that expertise to develop.
Just back to what Joe was saying, I was just thinking, surely the company size makes a difference that you're working for. Like if you're working for, say, some of the bigger companies, you may be able to be a little bit more siloed, a bit more focused in on, say, certain things. But the smaller companies, they won't be able to do that. Resources will be limited. So you'll need to have those transferable skills, a broader view almost of everything, surely, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the difference is in the agency and brand or client side world, is that a lot of businesses that have the larger internal teams, it's due to the fact that they've invested into those internal teams over the years, and they're saying, right, we're going to take that budget away from agency and bring that in-house. But equally, you've got businesses that just don't facilitate that. So you tend to find there's still outsourcing maybe like PR or digital performance specifically to agencies to manage, but you're typically more of a generalist in-house looking after multi-channel marketing. But it, again, in terms of developing skill sets and talent, it really does depend on what business you're working for, which agency you're working for, as to where you can get exposure and learning and development from.
Okay. And I guess if there's one thing that you want to say to watch out for this year.
What's the hot trend?
Yeah, what's the hot
coming, the hot take.
Gosh, good question. It's definitely that AI piece, I think, and I know we've talked a lot about it, but I even went to the MadFest festival in London a couple of weeks back, and this is where a lot of the talk still really is people starting to really understand how they can integrate it into their day-to-day business. So that, I think, moving forward over the next 6 months is going to be...
I think you're right, and that's, we've been at a lot of events sort of as the current financial year drew to a close there in June, and a lot of the talk about AI, it can be so exhausting, but it's sort of like the age of social media when it was born. There's a delay of 6, 12, 18 months, maybe even longer, who knows, but at some point it's going to work its way in internally and externally, and so it will start to impact job descriptions and job roles, and there'll be necessary skills.
We're still in a talking phase at the moment. I thought a little while ago, we are moving out of the talking phase, but I think actually no, we're still in that phase. Like you just said, we're in a phase now of understanding it.
Yeah.
So now it's a case of implementing it.
Yeah.
So I think we're still going to be hearing about it. Once it's integrated, then I think the conversations will die down a little bit.
Yeah, maybe. Who knows? It'll be being taught in universities soon enough.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it will need to be.
Terrific. Well, we're almost out of time, Jodie, but before we let you go, we've got the Performance Marketing Unlocked tradition, the Resell Me a Pen challenge.
Okay.
Now, I've let you decide what it is that you want to resell for this.
Yes.
You have 60 seconds to do so.
Oh,
I'm going to have Jyoti adjudicate this week,
Okay.
because I think this is the first Resell Me a Pen challenge you've had the pleasure of sitting in on.
Yeah, it has been. So
I'll get up my timer and we'll put you on the clock. Jodie, you have 60 seconds. Do you want to tell us first what it is you're going to be reselling?
I was going to say I'm going to, because I'm also conscious this is going to really show my age. But I've gone with the overhead projector.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, because I was looking through and I was like, what could I do? And it just brings... So, it was really interesting, actually, when I started doing a bit of prep around the overhead projector in terms of its USPs.
Yeah,
but also the nostalgia I think it brings to people. I just picture sitting in school, in primary school assembly, with he's got the whole world in his hands, lyrics up on the wall, or cauliflower's fluffy. I mean, I'm really going there, aren't I?
Well, we don't want to... I don't want you to spoil all your terrific sales content before we jump into it.
But yeah, go on. I'll let you go before I say my piece.
Are you doing one as well?
No. So afterwards.
I can tell Jyotie's already got a ton of thoughts. So I'm excited to see how this unfolds. I'll give you the sort of warning when you've got about 5 seconds left, Jodie, because we'll try to get it in under time, but you can take it away right now.
Great. So the overhead projector has been running since the 1930s. It is a piece of equipment that has the ability to share documents, so whether that's wording or images, on a large, I say screen, but it's almost like a projector screen or wall to a large audience. It's really reliable and versatile in terms of what you can use it for, and it's used all the way through. I mean, it was probably at its peak in the 80s, hence obviously my comments on using that. But it led to, its launch and use has really led to its longevity, and it's been really useful for discussions across smaller or larger audiences, role plays, class activities, and like I say, the best part of it was your primary school assemblies.
Terrific. 58 seconds, so right on time. That's about as good as it gets. Jyoti, what do we think?
So I thought that was great.
Thank you.
It brought back memories for me. So
perfect.
I'm showing my age as well. But definitely school assemblies. He's got a whole world in his hand. That was,
Shall we sit? No, I'm joking.
I think
go on.
I think you're right. it's a good pitch. It brings in an element of nostalgia. I was a kid in the 90s and it was still very much well used then, and even actually when I went into secondary school. So I think, yeah.
And I was trying to think, just going on from it, what do they use now that is so widely used as what the overhead projector was? Because I don't know, but I would imagine it's digital boards.
It must be a laptop.
It's something.
But you still need a projector.
My take on this is I don't know that an overhead projector is as outdated as perhaps we think, because I certainly used it throughout my high school and university experience as a Gen Z representative. I think a really interesting point you bring up is I love the nostalgia well, though, because that's what the challenge is all about. Another element that I think the projector, where it kind of wins in that USP, is the way that younger audiences are actually using it in lieu of a TV. I've seen this trend. I don't know if either of you have, but I've got friends, and I've seen across social media, people who purchase a projector as opposed to a TV, and they can stream from their laptop directly onto their wall, or even they can lie down in bed, look up at their roof, and they can put it up there and watch movies, TV shows, films. Digital... So I think it's more versatile than even we give it credit for.
I think I am. Right.
Listen, Jodie, that was a terrific way to round out the show. It was an absolute pleasure having you in studio today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And a big thank you to Jyoti Rambhai as well, our premium content editor, for joining me on the show.
Thanks, Joe. It's been a while, so it's been great to be here today.
And that concludes this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. A big thank you to both Jodie and Jyoti for joining me on today's show, for fascinating discussions about not only the IPA Bellwether and the slightly brighter look ahead for the UK economy, but in particular that discussion surrounding the job market when it comes to the marketing and advertising industry. Those were some really fascinating insights, and as the economy picks up, it's interesting to see the impact it's having on the jobs for all that work in our very up and down and fast moving industry. I'm sure you all enjoyed that discussion as much as I did. A big thank you, as always, to you, the listener, for tuning in and putting up with my enunciation of Jodie, Jyoti and Joe. I'm sure that was as difficult for all of you to listen to and make sense of as it was for me to try and enunciate them. No, but as always, it's a real pleasure hosting this show for you all, and I thank you all for tuning in each and every fortnight as you do. Please, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice. And if you're so inclined, leave us a positive rating and review. Those things go a long way to making sure we can keep doing this show that you all enjoy. In the meantime, have a lovely week, and we'll be back shortly with another episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. Bye for now.